Have you ever looked at the movies of today and wondered where all the 2D animated cartoons have gone? And why they've been completely replaced by 3D animation? 2D and 3D animation have some interesting nuances behind them. How they are created, how long it takes to make them, where the majority of the effort is focused, and how much effort is required. But before we dive into the nuances of animation, let's look at its history. The first forms of moving pictures, created using the zoetrope and the magic lantern, utilizes what we would consider to be 2D animation. They were a lot like the animated GIFs of today. The first fully animated cartoon was in 1906. It was called Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. 1914's Gertie the Dinosaur was actually an attempt to get around a pervasive problem during the black and white era. Originally, in order to animate the characters, there needed to be a lot of white space around them so they did not get lost in the background, and so the background did not have to be redrawn. In Gertie the Dinosaur, every single frame was redrawn. Of course this took an immense amount of time, but it looks so much better compared to the vacant voids characters were normally stuck in, so there needed to be a way to keep the fantastic backgrounds without having to redraw it every time someone moves. This led to cell animation, where a background would be drawn and characters drawn on transparent paper called cells are then laid on top of them. In 1915, the technique of rotoscoping was discovered. Basically, rotoscoping is tracing a moving image. This allowed for more complex and natural movements to be utilized. Rotoscoping was actually used in the first feature-length animated movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937. It was also the first animated film to use Technicolor. This film set Disney on a course towards becoming a giant in the industry and put animation into the competitive film market. For almost 70 years, the only form of animation was 2D. But in 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first 3D animated movie, though the first use of CGI in a movie was actually in 1983's Rock'n'Rule. 3D animation quickly conquered the market on animation, slowly pushing out any and all 2D animation. Pixar became known for releasing hit after hit every 1 to 2 years. While Disney's 2D work during the time wasn't bad, it was just overshadowed by the innovation, much like the film industry's transition from silent to sound or black and white to color. That brings us to today. The last mainstream 2D animated film was Disney's Winnie the Pooh, which barely made back its budget, while Frozen ranks 13th highest grossing film of all time. 3D animation is now the norm, and is clearly king. Or is it really? Consider this. What if 3D animation isn't the pinnacle of animation? It is certainly profitable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is much better than 2D animation. Technically speaking, the reason why some movies do better than others comes down to it actually being a good movie. And marketing. So it isn't fair to judge the two mediums solely based on that. Instead, we will compare the two based on what they bring to the table, their techniques, their capabilities, their difficulties, and their pitfalls. In terms of techniques, the two styles are very similar in nature and share common parallels. 3D animation can utilize a technique similar to rotoscoping, called motion capture. Utilizing a lot of colored balls and special suits, the motions of the actors are recorded into the 3D modeling program, where they can be turned into motions for the bones of the figure. Keyframes are utilized in all forms of animation, even claymation. They are basically the key parts of each movement, broken down into more manageable chunks. In 2D animation, there are usually 12 to 16 keyframes per second, primarily due to the cost behind making each frame. 3D animation, because of the interpolation between each keyframe, technically can have as many as 60 keyframes per second, while the animator only has to create 10 or 12. However, this doesn't necessarily make 3D animation faster or easier than 2D. Each have their own problems with time and money. Some things are harder to animate in 3D than they are in 2D, and vice versa. One spot 3D animation has a significant leg up on 2D animation is regarding art assets. Once a 3D model has been made and rigged, it can be used for any and all permutations. In 2D animation, a cell or completed frame is generally only used once, and on very few occasions is it reused. Money spent on a 3D model can save money down the line, but money spent on a frame of 2D animation has no impact on the cost of further frames. But in that 3D model consistency, there is a problem. What if you want the character to do something the model was not designed to do? The model must be broken for this motion, which carries some risks. One of the more obvious and well-known problems is clipping. This refers to when the geometry of an object goes through the geometry of another. It is more often seen in video games, where animations sometimes go awry. Speaking of that, One of the reasons 3D animation costs so much and is so difficult is actually because of the coding. Yes, there's actually a lot of coding and mathematics involved in 3D animation. In fact, 3D models are nothing but math. There are various points in a 3D plane that are connected with each other. And sometimes something breaks.
No, it's perfect. It just needs a few homey touches.
Of course, all that madness is necessary to get 3D models to work and look good. Meanwhile, 2D animation's answer to all problems is just draw it. Animation error? Just draw it. Discontinuity? Redraw it. Fixing 2D animation is incredibly simple. Another difficulty in 3D animation, related to the model consistency problem, is the problem of a model being affected by the world. It is very rare for a character to get dirty or covered in something that sticks around for several scenes. This is because of how the models themselves work. If one wants to add dirt to a character, then a new texture map must be made, which takes art assets. Similarly, new clothes require new models, forcing a limitation on the number of clothing choices, but the biggest problem is transformations. Now, in 2D animation, the answer to how to put a character in new clothes or to add dirt is just draw it. The same applies with transformation sequences, they just have to draw it. But in 3D animation, transformations require new models for each step. As an example, here's the Worgen transformation from World of Warcraft. There is the human, which is the first model. Then adding one Worgen arm is another, and another for the second. And finally the finished transformation. 4 models for one transformation. If one wishes to have more steps, that would require more models. 3D animation may be more consistent than 2D, but that consistency is to a fault. One would then assume that it is the enormous costs that make 2D animation unviable compared to 3D animation. Except, I have the production budget for 2 Disney films. The Princess and the Frog had a production budget of $105 million, while Frozen had $150 million. Disney spent roughly the same amount of money on both. 3D animation costs a bit more than 2D in reality. Well, one must take longer then? Frozen took at least 2 years from announcement to release, and 1 year from announcement of director to release. Similarly, The Princess and the Frog began production in roughly 2007, and was released in 2009, so the production cycles are also similar in length. So the cost and timeframes are similar, so why does 3D animation win over 2D animation? It could be the art form itself. Each brings its own aesthetic to the table. 3D brings a consistent look that is closer to reality, while 2D is free to stretch and go wild with its animation. Certainly, anything one medium can do, the other can do as well, but not without great difficulty. There isn't much difference between the mediums. Each has their bonuses and limitations. It is easy to fix problems in 2D animation, but it can be inconsistent, and any art assets used are useless in the future. 3D animation has problems that aren't easy to fix, but is always consistent in its appearance, sometimes to the point of being a detractor, and any art assets created can save time later. 2D and 3D are too similar for us to say which one is better. Each one has its upsides, each one has its downsides. They are both equal.